What's up, everyone? Jackson Fuller here, and you are listening to the third episode of Hoggin the Mic. I'll be joined by Andrew Hutchinson momentarily to discuss the past week of Arkansas Razorback sports. And yes, it will be more like the past 10 days of Razorback sports. Apologies in advance for not getting this episode out on Monday this week, but with some heavy snow, terrible roads, some issues from Hutch, and some travels from myself, we weren't able to record until today, Wednesday. But honestly, we're kind of thankful. A Monday podcast would have had incredibly depressing vibes. Instead, we get to also discuss Tuesday night's dramatic win over Texas A&M. Where the heck would the Hogs be this season without Tramon Mark? We will also dive into the losses to Florida and Georgia before a little bit of football and baseball talk. As always, thank you guys so much for continuing to listen as we grow this little podcast. So without further ado, here's Hutch and Hoggin the Mic. Hutch, how's it going, man? How much sleep have you gotten since last night's 3-hour marathon inside Bud Walton Arena?
Not a whole lot of sleep. Don't really get to sleep in much these days. Although I will say my 4-year-old didn't come and wake me up until 7:30 this morning, so that was much appreciated. So I did get a few hours of sleep. It was hard to, even after I was done riding last night, kind of hard to kind of shut things off after such a kind of thrilling victory for Arkansas last night that went down to the last second. So feeling pretty good though.
Yeah, thrilling is one word for it. Nerve-wracking, almost season-ending, maybe. I guess that's two words, but since we last spoke, Arkansas has gone 1-2. They beat Texas A&M last night. Of course, they lost to Georgia and Florida on the road. Tramon Mark just kind of saved their season last night with 35 points in that game winner. They would have been 0-4 in the SEC. I think that would have been the first time since 2008, 2009 that they started the SEC 0-4. Before we dive into any of the specifics of each game, just what are some of your first thoughts that come to mind after the past three games? Where are you with this team? And, maybe how can – I guess, are you just used to the fact now that they can put up such stinkers against, a team like Florida and then bounce back 3 days later and beat a really quality team in Texas A&M?
No, not surprised. I mean, that's kind of par for the course for Arkansas across all sports, if we're being honest. I mean, you mentioned that 08-09 season, and I'm pretty sure that was the year Arkansas beat Oklahoma and Texas when they were top 10 teams in the span of a week during non-conference play, and then went like 2-14 in SEC play. So this season was starting to feel very similar to that, because of the early wins against Purdue. Again, I know it was an exhibition, but and then Duke as well in non-conference play, and then they just kind of, stink the rest of the year. It was starting to feel a little bit like that. So for them to beat Texas A&M, kind of got the season maybe back on track. We'll see if they can actually string together, a win against South Carolina coming up. But I mean, just overall, they've still got a lot of work to do. I know there's some Arkansas fans that are very optimistic that are going to say, "Oh, well, this is they're doing what they do under Eric Musselman. They're going to flip the switch and they're going to go on a run and make the NCAA tournament." And I'm like, well, we'll see. They've dug themselves quite the big hole. They did jump from 113 to 110 in the net rankings after that win against Texas A&M. So I mean, that's a little bit, but again, you're not making the NCAA tournament with a 110 net ranking unless you win the SEC tournament. So still a lot of work to do, but it was, again, nice to see them get over get off the schneid and win a game in the SEC.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the Purdue game. I don't know if I wanted to start here with discussion about Texas A&M, but I'm going to. It was crazy. I thought that Muss brought up the Purdue game last night in his press conference because, like you said, I think we put a lot into that game. I think fans put a lot into that game, but Musselman he hasn't really brought it up too much this season. He has at times, but it hasn't been like a constant thing that he's harkened back to when trying to talk about this team's potential. He brought it up last night after the win, and I think that kind of told the story of where Muss's mindset is right now, because the starting lineup he played last night, I believe, was the same exact starting lineup he started against Purdue. It's the same lineup he started against Duke. He gave Ellis another chance. He kind of, went back to some of the roots from earlier this season. And look, that starting lineup hadn't been great earlier in the year, but they had won some games and they beat Duke. Well, I guess Mark didn't even play against Duke, so it wasn't the exact same starting lineup. But Ellis being involved, some very similar things with the rotation. You saw some, he gave Jeremiah Davenport a shot early in the game, and he's done that a couple times recently. And Davenport made some threes and kind of justified that. I think in a way, I mentioned this on the last podcast. I think Muss is starting to realize maybe there were just too much changes early in the season. That this was a team that needed some stability, especially considering all of the transfers that came in. But he needed to kind of get back to some things that the team was comfortable with. And look, they only won by 1 point, and it required a game-winning basket with 1 second left. But they played their best game that they have in a long, long time last night. Do you think that this is something that Muss maybe needs to do moving forward? Can he, have a little bit of a longer leash with some guys, or was this just a one-night thing where, like he said, he wanted some veterans out there, and moving forward, it still needs to be kind of matchup dependent?
I think it's probably still going to change, but I do think he's not going. I don't think he's going to go back to where he's playing, 10 guys equal minutes in the first half like he's had a couple of times. I mean, I feel like, because Battle didn't play at all in that last night's game. So, I feel like he's going to play. He's your second leading scorer. He's going to play. Maybe just in the doghouse right now. Who knows what's going on there? Muss said it wasn't injury based. It was a coach's decision. So, you figure he's going to play at some point. And, we saw what Layden Blocker and Joseph Pinion did against Georgia. I thought they were going to get at least some decent run in the first half. Pinion didn't get off the bench, and Blocker didn't play until the last minute of the game. So it's very weird. It's very interesting, but Muss does seem to be trying to kind of bring things down into his usual 7 or 8 guys that are going to play the bulk of the minutes. I'm just wondering if maybe those 7 or 8 guys might change from game to game, depending on, as you said, matchups or who's got the hot hand or things like that.
Yeah, the Joseph Pinion decision I wasn't completely surprised about. I think Muss has kind of shown this over the course of the season that there's not a lot of trust there for whatever reason. I'm assuming it starts with the defensive side of the ball, but Joseph just hasn't gotten a real look until the Florida game. And yeah, he played well, but I think that was, like Muss said last night, that was kind of a message to the entire team. Hey, if you play hard, you're going to get consistent minutes no matter when you come in the game. Blocker, it was a surprise that he didn't play last night, but if I had to guess, there's a fear with the Arkansas coaching staff of what that half-court offense looks like with him out there. Because, yeah, he can make some good plays defensively, and they can get out and transition when he does, and he's terrific as a guard, offensive rebounding and doing some of the hustle plays. But when the game kind of slows down, he's just not yet the offensive weapon that maybe even Ellis can be, or Battle, who also didn't play last night. And I think he, at this point offensively, Muss just feels a little bit more confident with some of the other guards. And I think given what Jeremiah Davenport did last night, I think Muss's decision was validated in a lot of ways. And hey, he threw the freshman on there for a big defensive possession that ended up making a difference when he fought hard for a rebound that originally was called Texas A&M ball, and the referees reversed the call. So, yeah, I tend to agree with you that I think it's going to continue to change, but I don't think it should. I think, like, at this point in the season, we've got some, Arkansas has played its best, I think, with this group. With when Ellis is playing well, they're playing their best, and he hasn't had a good game coming off the bench ever, this season. So maybe you start him and you hope, Menafield, you bring Menafield off the bench, and hopefully Menafield can be the spark when, Ellis just hasn't been able to do that. There's clearly, I think we saw last night, there's still a dedication to wanting Menafield to get minutes and make an impact, right, Hutch? I mean, he played a lot despite foul trouble and being either the 6th or 7th guy off the bench.
Yeah, that was crazy. He had like 4 fouls in 9 minutes of action, and he got like those 2 back-to-back fouls where he had to go back to the bench. But then he played the rest of the game when he checked back in, and I can't remember when it was, but he didn't come off the floor, and they needed that. I mean, especially when Devo got ejected, they needed him out there, and it didn't look good, but they were able to pull it out with him on the floor. So yeah, he's still going to be a valuable piece. Maybe not the complete difference maker that maybe we thought he might be after, he had that 30-point game or whatever, and you're thinking, okay, this guy's going to save the season. That was probably a little too much to expect from him, but he is going to be a valuable and key piece for them. And as you said, Ellis, to me, that was probably the biggest surprise of the game. I mean, we can talk about Tramon Mark's 35 points. We can talk about all that kind of stuff. But to me, Ellis doing what he did, getting 6 rebounds, I mean, that was crazy because that was probably the thing that was one of the things that was keeping him off the floor, is that he couldn't go rebound. I think Muss even called him out at one point for the lack of rebounding earlier on. And he had not played very much at all the last several games. I think the last time he had started was, I can't even remember. It's been so long. And not only was he not starting, but he was playing 3 minutes, and that was it. So for him to not only start but then play as much as he did was truly probably the biggest surprise to me of the game last night.
Pretty sure he started last against Abilene Christian, but only played 3 minutes and got immediately yanked and then didn't come back in. And Menafield, I think, played the entire second half of that game, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, that was a surprise. But look, he pushed the right buttons there. I think Menafield was playing really well when he was in the game and available. And there was part of me that was like, man, watching these two guys play, it is kind of obvious that Menafield is just a little bit more consistent. But when he checked out with 2 fouls left, I thought Ellis rose to the occasion, and he scored, I think 10 points in the second half, something like that. And he went 8 from 8 from the free throw line. He was aggressive, and I think that translated, like you said, defensive rebounding and attacking the basket, because that's something that Arkansas, I think, has lacked this year. And that's why Menafield was such a revelation when he started to play. He was relentlessly going to the hoop or playing fast. And Tramon Mark is a terrific offensive player, but he's not as twitchy maybe as some of the other guards. He doesn't get to the hoop with ease. It's a lot of craft around the rim. Arkansas needs someone consistently to get to the paint. And whether that's Menafield, KB, Ellis, Devo. We'd love for it to be Trevin Brazil, but that just hasn't manifested itself this year. It has to be someone, and last night it was Ellis. Is there anything you specifically think from last night's game that Arkansas can take moving forward and try and replicate? I don't know, any schematic things or rotation wise, or what do you think is from the Texas A&M win is something that Muss can kind of make a fixture, hopefully, going into the South Carolina game and permanently this season?
I think he did learn a little bit about his rotation. I know we talked earlier about how I think he's going to kind of change a little bit from game to game, but you kind of know the general pieces that are going to be there. And I think now we know, or at least we think we know, that Ellis is going to be part of that. I think that was something we really learned, but it's also, I don't know how much schematically and everything. I mean, they did look really good offensively in the first half. Maybe you can take something from that, but they also got to the free throw line 40 times, and I just don't think that that's going to happen too often. I hope not. I don't know if I could stand another 2-hour and 38-minute marathon again, especially if it starts at 8 o'clock. So we'll see if there's anything that they can carry over. And I thought they did, at least also in the first half, played better defensively. I know Texas A&M is not exactly the best offensive team in the world, but they did defend better, I thought, than they had been. And if they can rebound a little bit better, I know that's been a little bit of an issue at times. And A&M's a really good rebounding team. But, I mean, you take out Texas A&M's offensive rebounds or just cut them in half and take away some of those second-chance points. I think they had 5 second-chance points. Then Arkansas wins that game easily, and it doesn't even come down to the last second. So I think there's some things they can still work on, but maybe there's some things they can take. But I think the biggest thing is probably learning that Ellis is going to be part of your rotation.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback off what you said about the first half being really good offensively. And for me, one of the things that they did consistently in that first half was they kind of spammed that little high pick and roll or a pick and pop with the center, or where, I think Muss said after the game it was a byproduct of Texas A&M trapping aggressively, and they wanted to get the ball to their 5-man and create a 4-on-3 situation. and Chandler Lawson excelled out of that. I think he had 4 assists last night. Even Mekhi Mitchell had an assist out of that. I would like to see that more, whether a team is trapping aggressively or just switching or like dropping. I think you have guards that are capable driving the basketball and are fast, athletic SEC point guards. I'd like to see Ellis, KB, Menafield, shoot, maybe even Devo and Tramon, like just spam some really, really stretched out high pick and rolls or pick and pops and force the defense to come up and guard away from the basket. And if you can get that 4-on-3 situation, you have some big guys that are capable passers that can take advantage of it. I know Muss is an NBA guy and a former Warriors coach. I mean, that's basically how the Warriors won, 4 titles, was that Draymond Green high pick and roll and letting him just carve a defense up. Arkansas doesn't have a Draymond Green, but it is a strategy I think that they could really implement moving forward, is just maybe a little bit more simple pick and rolls. And because it feels like to me too much this season, they're trying to get the ball to the high post. But when they do, it's still, the paint is packed, and that's not necessarily a recipe for success all the time. Real quick, Hutch. First half, Arkansas 53% from the field, 50% from 3. Second half, they were 24% from the field and 22% from 3. That the second half is exactly why this team has struggled all season. It's just, I mean, you cannot make 6 field goals in 20 minutes in basketball and expect to win. And I know they blew a big lead and, they played really well in the first half, but in a lot of ways they were almost lucky to win that game last night based off how poorly they played offensively in the second half. And like what you said, the offensive rebounds they gave up. I imagine at this point in the season, we're just going to have to live with those offensive rebounds because Arkansas is not a good defensive rebounding team.
Yeah, that second half was brutal offensively, as you said. I mean, it was very, very much more similar to the offense that we've come to expect out of this Arkansas team, unfortunately. Maybe it was something with that end of the floor because, I mean, A&M's first half was atrocious too, and I think A&M started 1 of 11 on that goal, and I think Arkansas started 1 of 12 in the second half on the same goal. So maybe it was something to do with the goal. I don't know, but it's probably more just Arkansas being what they've been, and maybe they can take something from that pick and roll stuff that you were just talking about, because that is something Eric Musselman will do. Is if he figures out what's working, he will go to it all the time. Now, I remember his first year here when they had Mason Jones, they had a play. I cannot for the life of me remember what the name of the play was because Muss has talked about it all the time, but they ran the heck out of it almost every single play. And that's why Mason Jones was a co-SEC player of the year that year, is because they figured out what was working and they stuck with it and they did it and it was effective. And who knows, if COVID doesn't hit, maybe they make a run in the SEC tournament and get in the NCAA tournament because they were playing really well at the ends with that play. So that maybe if he figures out and he likes that, then they will spam it, like you were saying. They will do that if it's working.
Interesting. I hope they do. I'm going to ask Muss about that whenever we get him before the South Carolina game this week. And if I don't, maybe you can, or you can remind me too. Just if that was something that was strictly a Texas A&M thing, or maybe they can find success with that moving forward. And who knows if he gives me an honest answer? Although for the most part he does. So shout out to Muss for his honesty. Let's see here. I mean, I think that a lot has changed and a lot hasn't changed since the Florida game. I'll be honest with you, Hutch, and with all the listeners, I did not watch a single second. I was on a bachelor party in North Carolina and was just kind of keeping up with it from afar. It looked pretty bad from afar. I don't think they were ever really in the game. What happened in the UF game? Walk me through, what led to. I thought they played decent at times against Georgia and found some life in the second half, and then none of that obviously carried over to Gainesville. What went wrong for Arkansas against Florida?
Well, Florida, they couldn't defend Florida early on, to be quite honest. I mean, it was a lot of the same issues. That Florida was getting to the rim at will. They could score really easily. I think they had like a 22-2 run very early on and kind of put the game away. But then about midway through the first half, something crazy happens. Eric Musselman implemented a zone. Probably the first time he said it was the first time he's ever done that in college as a college head coach. And he has talked in the past. I mean, you don't know this, Jax, because you haven't been here, But like we've asked Muss in the past, like about running a zone, and he basically like scoffs at the idea. He's like, "I'm a man-to-man coach. That's what we're going to run. It's what we're always going to run." Well, they went to a zone, and lo and behold, they actually went on a little mini run there at near the end of the first half. They cut it to a more manageable, deficit. I think at one point they got it within 9. But then, they also put in Layden Blocker and Joseph Pinion. But then, they didn't have enough. I mean, it was good for a little bit, but then I think Eric Musselman said after the game, like, hey, whether it's a zone or a man, you've still got to defend your zone or defend your man, and Arkansas still wasn't doing that. That's what led to the 22-point loss, and it made me wonder, like, maybe they'll do something. Maybe they'll play Pinion and Blocker a little bit moving forward, or maybe they'll mix in a little bit of zone here and there just to keep teams off their feet or whatever, on their toes. But I don't remember that happening at all against Texas A&M. So I don't know how much you could really learn from. I think maybe the biggest takeaway, as Muss said after the game, was that, Blocker and Pinion's play was kind of a message to the other guys, like, hey, you better be on your game or you're going to lose your minutes. And I think that maybe is probably going to be the lasting effect from that game, if there is one, to take away moving forward.
Interesting. I think those 2-game road trips in conference play, and most of the times teams will come back before they go. I mean, Muss told us, though, that they stayed away from Fayetteville and went to Gainesville. I mean, those are tough a lot of times when you lose that first game, and you kind of want to get back home after a road loss to try and get some good vibes and some confidence going. From where my vantage point, it felt like they just needed to get home. They needed to kind of get back in front of their home fans and really maybe get back to work and practice in a comfortable environment coming out of the Georgia game. And of course they couldn't do that. They had to shift focus and get ready for Florida. The Georgia game I did watch and wrote about, and looking back on it this week and before last night's game, I found myself thinking, wow, Arkansas didn't really play that bad. Like, there was a 5-minute stretch in the first half where I think Georgia out-physicaled them, made some threes. There was some sloppy turnovers that turned into Georgia threes, and all of a sudden Georgia was up 10. And then from that point forward, the game kind of hovered at that 10-point mark the entire time. Arkansas, of course, got it close, and then Georgia answered back. But that there was really only a 3-5-minute stretch, I think, that proved to be the difference in that game, despite the 10-point disparity. Are you as optimistic as me about the Georgia performance, or do you kind of go the other way, which I was feeling immediately coming out of that game, where it's like, this Georgia team, I know they're off to a good start, but that's a winnable road SEC game, and Arkansas just simply did not get it done.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they, you mentioned they got down by 10, but then it hovered around there. I mean, they showed some fight, and you don't want to get too much of a moral victory or anything like that. But considering what they had just done the previous game against Auburn, where they literally quit, like, I mean, Keon Minifield after the game admitted they quit. To see them fight on the road against what seems to be a pretty good Georgia team that I think they had Tennessee on the ropes a couple of games ago. So that's a good team apparently, and they fought. They didn't just roll over and lose. They could have lost by much more than 10 points. And so that, to me, that was encouraging. That may be like a little bit of a homer take or whatever, but it was encouraging and gave me hope going into the Florida game. And then, of course, they go and lose by 22, and it was never really that close. You're like, okay, well, what's going on here? It just seems to be kind of an up-and-down team. But, I think that the performance against Georgia was easily their second-best performance of SEC play so far, behind the A&M game last night.
Yeah. Real quick, a couple things, and then we'll shift focus here. Musselman's press conference last night. I've talked about it a little bit. He said some very interesting things, but I didn't really sense a lot of optimism. And I coming out of, even in the ups and downs of the season so far, when they have won games, he's been pretty upbeat and happy, albeit I think maybe Lipscomb aside. But he's had some optimism. I didn't sense that. Of course, his voice was a little hoarse from yelling and celebrating after the big win, but I think there were still a lot of like concerns he was trying to echo in that press conference. Do you agree with that? Do you think maybe I'm over analyzing his hoarse voice? And what do you think Musselman is where is he at with this team right now? Because there are lots and lots of frustrations, but obviously, like he mentioned the Purdue game, he mentioned the Duke game, there is some hope deep down in there.
Yeah, I think you're probably spot on there. I mean, he sounded more relieved, in my opinion, than he was excited or pumped up. He in the past, he has been very happy after any SEC win because he talks about how hard it is to win in conference and all that kind of stuff. And last night it was much more, not quite as extreme, but very similar to those Lipscomb vibes post game, where it was a game they won but they nearly squandered. I think that's kind of what he felt, and I think this team is giving him some gray hairs a little bit. It's stressing him out, but as you said, I mean, he knows what their potential is because he saw it against Purdue, against Duke, and even they were competitive against Memphis in the Bahamas, and they were competitive for a half against North Carolina. So I mean, they've had moments where you're like, okay, this team is potentially going to, is an NCAA tournament team, but then they go out and they look terrible against Auburn or whoever. They lose to Greensboro early on. So I think he's still trying to figure this out. I didn't get the sense last night that this was oh my gosh, they've gotten over the hump, they've turned the corner, and now they're going to go on a run. I think Eric Musselman knows that there is more work to do, that they've got more things they've got to improve on before he gets confident. We're like, okay, this team's rolling. We're going to make a run. We're going to win, 12 of 14 games and make a run in the NCAA tournament. I don't think he's quite there yet.
Yeah, I agree. And you kind of mentioned their close calls and who they've lost to. Just as a reminder for everyone, they've got 7 losses this year. Here are 4 of them. Number 3, North Carolina. Number 11, Auburn. Number 12, Memphis. And number 16, Oklahoma. I mean, not many teams are going to beat those 4 teams this year. That's what makes the UNC Greensboro home loss and losing both of those SEC road games so crucial to me. I mean, I think if Arkansas had beaten UNC Greensboro and just split on the road in the SEC, they might be an on-the-bubble team right now, even with all the inconsistency. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to have expected them to beat UNC Greensboro, of course, but then to have probably gotten that Georgia game under their belt. Of course, unable to win any of those 3 games, so we're all talking in hypotheticals here. But I do think that there's a part of me, a part of the fan base, a part of the coaching staff and players that at sometimes maybe this season have been a little bit too down on the team, just considering they've lost to some really, really high quality competition. But there's no more excuses at this point. Like, you got to beat the highest quality of competition left on your schedule. And that brings me to my final question for you, Hutch, about this basketball team, before we move on. I don't think we need to rehash our predictions of whether they make the NCAA tournament or not, but I've got a different version of that question. How many games do you think they have to win to make the NCAA tournament now? They're 10-7, 1-3 in the SEC, and there are 14 SEC games left. How many do you think they've got to win to make the tournament?
Definitely a higher number than last year. I think they made the NCAA tournament last year as an 8 or a 9 seed with an 8-10 conference record, but that was because they had a really good non-conference slate. I think I've said all along that I feel like they might need to go 10-8 just to get to the NCAA tournament. That would give them 19 regular season wins, and you might need to win a game in the SEC tournament as well. But I mean, you've been ranked 100 or worse most of the time in the net rankings, and that means something. And they haven't really been lighting the world on fire in other metrics either. I don't know where they are at KenPom right now after the game. I think they were like 89th going into the game. So they're none of the metrics like Arkansas. I mean, as you said, they did lose to some really good teams, but I think the Greensboro loss, all that kind of stuff, that really puts them in a bind. You're gonna have to win some games. So I mean, they've won 1 and lost 3, so you got to win another 9 at least of the last 14. That's 9-5. Doable. It's going to be tough, but that's probably what you got to do. And if you win anything less than that, then you probably got to make a run, maybe at least the SEC championship game just to give yourself a chance.
Yeah, and I think it might be interesting who they beat could also play a part. Like I think they could. There's a chance. Like I mean, they've got Kentucky twice, Tennessee, Ole Miss left on the schedule. That's going to be 4 ranked games. I imagine maybe some of the other SEC teams could get ranked by the time they play Arkansas. Like maybe you can get in the tournament if you win 9 games, but you win 2, of the Kentucky and Tennessee games. But yeah, I think it's probably 10-8, maybe even 11-7 is the bare minimum, just because of those losses to UNC Greensboro and now Georgia and Florida. Florida maybe, but I guess both of those teams are potential tournament teams, but I don't think all 3 of Georgia, Florida, and Arkansas are making the tournament this year. Big Power 5 basketball usually has a way of working itself out by the end with the tiers and everybody who makes the tournament kind of making sense. But you never know. Maybe all 3 of those teams go on a big run here, and I'm completely wrong about that. So let's move over to football real quickly, and we did have some relatively big news for Sam Pittman's squad since we last spoke. I know it was a long time ago, but Arkansas announced Ronnie Fouch as its new wide receivers coach, replacing Kenny Guyton. Fouch was a co-offensive coordinator at Missouri State and worked under Bobby Petrino with the Bears and previously at Louisville. Just Hutch, overall thoughts on the hire. What do you make of Fouch? Not too much information of him out there, but seems like potentially an up-and-comer that Arkansas was able to snatch before some of the other big bad SEC schools might have been able to.
This is his first full-time FBS job. I know he'd worked for Bobby Petrino at Louisville as either a GA or quality control, something like that. But this is his first time being an on-field coach at the FBS level. He hadn't even worked at a Group of 5 school before, so it's a big deal for him. He has worked with Bobby Petrino before, so I think that was probably the big selling point, is that they were able to have that history, and Petrino knows what he's getting. He probably knows what Petrino's offense is like, so I think that's probably encouraging. To me, maybe the most interesting part of the hire, and I wrote about this when he first got announced and I got my hands on his contract. Not only is he the lowest paid assistant coach on the staff, which again makes sense considering he wasn't an experienced FBS assistant coach. It kind of reminded me of Michael Scher when he came over here to be the linebackers coach from Missouri. He had been a GA and quality control coach for the Tigers. He made, I think, even less than what Fouch is making right now. He turned out to be pretty good. Now he's defensive coordinator at UNLV and seems to be a nice up-and-comer right there. So maybe you got something similar. He was friends and knew very, very well Barry Odom, the defensive coordinator. So very similar to that. But in his contract, it does stipulate it's a 1-year deal with a second year if Sam Pittman is the head coach. I think that's a pretty big if to include in a contract there, because that's the first time Arkansas has acknowledged maybe Pittman won't be the head coach in 2025. To me, that says a lot. I mean, it's smart on their part because it gets you out of having to pay a buyout if they do make a change, because then you got to pay the buyouts not only of Sam Pittman but the assistant coaches. Well, now you're not on the hook for him if you do decide to make a change. But if you're that confident in Sam Pittman being your guy, which is what kind of the message Arkansas was trying to send, I think, why would you have to include that in his contract? To me, that was very, very interesting. And, there wasn't something included in Petrino's contract. It wasn't something included in Eric Mateos' contract. So, and they probably had a little bit more leverage with him being an inexperienced guy coming from the FCS ranks. But to me, that was maybe the more interesting part of this hire, because, again, it's a wide receivers coach. What are you going to know? I mean, maybe he'll be a good recruiter. Who knows? But to me, that was very interesting.
Yeah, I think you nailed it with the leverage part of Petrino and Mateos. I found it very interesting on a different angle, in that I think this is a Petrino guy, not necessarily a Sam Pittman guy. I mean, I'm sure Sam Pittman approved the hire and was happy with it, but he's got the connections to Petrino. And this being in his this clause being in his contract kind of makes me think, if Sam Pittman's not the answer, the pipe dream that some Arkansas fans have of Petrino getting the head coach job can be put to bed. I think, Hunt Yurachek has come out and said that, Petrino's not necessarily a head coaching candidate, and I think in an interview with Hogs Plus maybe or something like that. I'll need to go back and research that. So please don't journalistically credit me, any of the listeners. I didn't get my facts there at all 100% accurate, but I know, this was a Petrino hire, and to put that stipulation there tells me that not only is this like a very 1-year trial run for Sam, but if it doesn't work out for Sam, it probably isn't working out for Bobby long term here at the University of Arkansas. That they're kind of on they're obviously on the same team, but their success and their failures are going to be very much linked together this year. I can't imagine a scenario where Sam Pittman fails and Bobby Petrino does well enough where he has an argument to stay past Sam Pittman. So, but hopefully none of that matters. Hopefully it works out this year, and Sam's back in 2025, and Arkansas maybe has it back to where things were just a couple of years ago. And I will say that I think it is interesting as far as Fouch is concerned that they did go with an inexperienced guy. I mean, Arkansas, not a great season last year, hasn't had a whole lot of success in recent years. It's a SEC football job. I imagine they could have had a bigger talent pool to search from for a wide receivers coach, and they went with maybe an inexperienced guy. That tells me probably two things. Either Petrino and Pittman are really, really high on this guy as an up-and-comer, or potentially there are some financial aspects of this hire that the fans don't necessarily want to hear about. I know how it's going to be spun by Arkansas, that this is a Petrino up-and-coming guy, and probably that's probably the correct answer, but it doesn't hurt that they were able to have the leverage to put that clause in and maybe pay him less than some of the other wide receiver coaches in the SEC.
They are paying more for an offensive coordinator this year with Bobby Petrino, paying him I think $1.5 million. They were paying it's like 1.1. I think he's going to get a bump to like 1.175 or something like that. So you are paying more overall for your salary pool, but it does save you a little bit of money there. And I will say on Sam Pittman's behalf, this is what he does. Is he generally lets his coordinators have some freedom to hire assistant coaches. You look at Kenny Guyton himself. The reason he was here is because he had a connection to Kendall Briles, and that was what led to him getting hired. When he hired Barry Odom as his defensive coordinator, a lot of those defensive coaches were Barry Odom guys. He brought over Sam Carter was a defensive backs coach. Michael Scher, as I said earlier, linebackers coach. He even brought his offensive line coach, Brad Davis, who also had a Sam Pittman connection, so that helped as well. But the connections thing is very big for Sam Pittman, and big in across college football when it comes to assistant coaches. Cody Kennedy was hired because he was a GA for Pittman at Georgia. Eric Mateos was hired because he's a GA for Pittman at Arkansas. So that's kind of how these things go, and that's how it's sometimes easy to kind of identify who maybe the candidates are, just because, hey, this guy worked for him in the past and they've got in history. And that's how, Fouch, he worked for Petrino at Louisville, again at Missouri State. So it kind of made sense for him to go after a guy that he was familiar with.
Man, we could have a whole other podcast on coaches hiring their friends, because sometimes I look at that like, what are we doing? Like in Arkansas's point of view, I'm not saying any of these hires are not going to work out, but Arkansas hasn't really experienced that much success with Coach Pittman. They had one incredible year, one okay year, and a couple of bad years, sprinkled in between. Does it make sense to kind of hire your boys when you're not having the most success? I don't know. Everybody in college football does it, so maybe I'm the idiot there, but. All right, let's move on to baseball just real quick. D1 Baseball released its preseason top 25. Of course, I think D1 Baseball, widely regarded as one of the best national outlets for college baseball college baseball coverage. And I respect their opinion on a lot of things. When they write something, I listen. And Arkansas is number 3 in the country behind Florida and Wake Forest. Seems like the Hogs are going to be a consensus top 5 team across all the polls, but D1 Baseball called them the best pitching staff in the entire country, specifically their starting pitching staff and the options that they have coming out of the bullpen, with just a plethora of guys that throw heat from both sides. number 3 in the country, Hutch, after number 2 from Perfect Game. I asked you if it was kind of ho-hum then. I'm not going to ask the same question, but I am wondering, like, do we are we maybe overvaluing this team just a little bit, given last year's disappointment in the regional, and or does this feel right to you how high they
Yeah, I
are?
think it feels right. And I mean, you mentioned the disappointing, finish to the end the season last year in the regional, but I think that's how a lot of fans would talk about it, just because they've come to expect a certain level of success in the postseason. But they still won the SEC regular season. I mean, they won the conference that produced the national champion, and that says something right there. I mean, they were really really good. They have been probably, I mean, if you look at it statistically, probably the most dominant, consistently dominant program in the SEC, college baseball's most dominant conference since 2017, probably. I mean, that's more than half a decade. They have been the most dominant program. They just don't have a national title, and we've seen both of the Mississippi schools get their first national titles. LSU won it last year. So, I mean, Arkansas fans are kind of getting a little antsy, but I think the number 3 ranking is totally fair and accurate. And I agree with their assessment that they've got an incredible pitching staff. They've got an incredible starting rotation with Hagen Smith, Brady Tigert, Mason Molina. I've been writing about those guys the last couple of weeks, and I think they're going to be really, really good. I know D1 Baseball also ranked like the top freshman classes in the country, and Arkansas has the top number 1 freshman class in the country. And a lot of the big reason that is because a couple of pitchers they have, Gabe Gackle and Hunter Dietz. I mean, those dudes are legit. And on any other team, they might be competing for a spot in the starting rotation. On previous Arkansas teams, they might be competing for a spot in the starting rotation. But now they're just going to be key bullpen guys and maybe a midweek starter. So I think that's huge, and they've got all sorts of depth. They've got guys in the field and everything. You've got lots of different options there, even if you have some injuries. So to me, it looks like a top 5 team that should be in the thick of things come June.
Yeah, I said last week a little concerned about their hitting. D1 Baseball kind of mentioned some of those concerns in their assessment. Just they've got some transfers and just some guys that haven't shown that they can consistently hit SEC pitching that have the potential to do that, but haven't done it yet in a long-term college baseball season. I know Dave Van Horn's pretty confident that they're going to be able to hit the baseball this year, and hey, no better training for an offense than going up against the best pitching staff in America all off season. So a lot of excitement. I can't wait for the season to start, and man, it's just going to be fun if, knock on wood, hopefully the 3 starting pitchers over the weekend starters stay healthy this year, because Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you're going to be able to watch a lot of talent come through the mound at Fayetteville this season. So, all right, I think that's enough for baseball talk. Of course, we'll have plenty more as we ramp up towards the spring. Time to close things up with What the Hog, our weekly segment each obviously, where I share the craziest thing I've seen from Arkansas Twitter. Hutch, on Wednesday of last week, Nick Saban announced his retirement from Alabama, and I'm just going to read 2 tweets I saw from Arkansas fans immediately after. And when I say immediately after, I mean minutes after Nick Saban's retirement. I'm not going to shout out these guys' accounts just because I don't know them, and I feel like that would be mean. But from a Dusty, is there a chance that a lot of Bama players all hit the portal and come to the Hogs now? ? LOL. From a Mitch, the minute Bama falls off Arkansas' schedule, they become an 8-4 program. Just watch. Man, guys, it's Alabama. It's Alabama, and I know it's Nick Saban, but that's a lot of digging the grave for a history, tradition-rich program, and a funny way of making one of the greatest probably the greatest college football coach of all time's retirement about your program that's coming off a 4-8 season. So I found that very funny. Hutch, what do you make of that? And just overall, what do you've covered the SEC for a long time. What were your initial reactions to Nick Saban
Well, that
retiring?
reaction doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, Nick Saban has owned Arkansas. He went 17-0 against Arkansas as the Alabama head coach. He did lose a couple of times, I think, when he was at LSU. Here's a trivia question for you, a trivia answer. The last Arkansas quarterback to beat Nick Saban was Matt Jones with the Miracle on Markham, I'm pretty sure, in 2002, I want to say. Y'all can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but it's been a long, long time since Arkansas has beaten Nick Saban. And, Arkansas did get Drew Sanders, and he was an All-American from Alabama. And so now every time an Alabama player enters the transfer portal, whether he's a starter or backup or fifth stringer, Arkansas fans are going to be calling for, hey, let's get him. He's at Alabama. He must be good, which is probably true, but you're not always going to get a Drew Sanders. And also, those players aren't always going to consider you. I mean, I've seen where a couple of those Alabama guys have transferred now to Texas, which, again, just in the college football playoff. They're going to these programs that, are like Alabama. They're probably not going to transfer to a 4-8 program like Arkansas, unfortunately. Look at Drew Sanders. I mean, he transferred to a program coming off a 9-win season. It's a little bit different right now, and maybe you get the ball rolling and can, get some Alabama guys in future cycles. But, and then plus, Alabama's still going to be Alabama, I think. I mean, I think Kalen DeBoer, he's a tremendous coach. He's won everywhere he's been. He had a ridiculous win-loss record at the NAI level, then worked his way up through the coordinator ranks and head coach, and just took Washington, of all schools, which a good, solid, football program, good, solid football history, but not your traditional powerhouse, and took them to a national championship game. So I think that tells you right there he's a great coach, and give him the resources of Alabama, and he's probably going to have a lot of success there at Alabama. Will it be Nick Saban level? Probably not, because Nick Saban's the greatest of all time. But he should still win a lot.
Definitely. And look, this is what I'll say. I think Alabama under Nick Saban was terrifying, but there's a world where Alabama with an offensive minded guru is not just as terrifying, but still one of the scariest programs in the country. For all that Nick Saban has done in Alabama, they won games with defense and just, out recruiting the rest of the country. And there were times sprinkled in where they had the elite offenses, but for the most part, they controlled the line of scrimmage and ran the football. Kalen DeBoer he's shown wherever he's gone, he's going to put up major points and be innovative and have a just kind of crazy scheme. If he can somehow maintain the kind of recruiting, or come close to that recruiting and get those kinds of athletes to Alabama, you're going to see, the defense might take a step back, but you're going to see a very innovative offense down there in Tuscaloosa, and that's something we haven't seen in a while. And that, I think, should, SEC fans can be happy that Nick Saban is gone, but I love the hire. I think it's it's going to be tough to replace Saban, but Alabama did as good of a job as they could have finding that replacement. So, all right, I think that's it. Nearly 50 minutes today. We've been a little all over the place with our timing, but we're going to try and keep it under an hour for every episode. And this was another fun one. Hutch, thanks so much. As always, tell the listeners where they can find you on social media, where they can read your work, and maybe shout out one of your pieces that you did coming out of the Texas A&M game.
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter at NWA Hutch. Then you can also find all of my work at bestofarkansassports.com. Again, no paywall, everything free, including my story from the Texas A&M game, where I kind of zeroed in on some interesting decisions by Buzz Williams. We didn't really discuss it here on the podcast, but Buzz did make some interesting decisions there in the final 7 seconds that really helped Arkansas, which, it's always good when you're an Arkansas fan that you can, comment on the opposing coach's decision making than your own. So you can go check that out at bestofarkansassports.com.
Awesome. And everyone can find me on Twitter at JacksonFuller16. Read my stuff at swtimes.com. Last night I wrote about Ellis and his revival, his return to the starting lineup, but also just kind of why he's such an example of the Arkansas struggles this season, where they're unable to kind of find consistency from anyone on the roster, really, other than Tramon Mark. And Ellis is a perfect example of that. Hopefully, we're moving towards a better place with this team, and some of those guys start to find their way as the SEC picks up. And Arkansas continues its SEC schedule on Saturday against South Carolina. We will be back with our 4th episode of Hoggin the Mic Monday, January 2022. And we'll be recapping that game against the Gamecocks and looking forward to a very, very big road game against Ole Miss right around the corner. So, Hutch, as always, thanks for joining me. I'll see you Saturday, and thank you to all the listeners for tuning in every week. We really appreciate it.